All right, guys, Chris here with The Unshakable Man, and this is week 5, Uncovering Shadow. So, first of all, one of the pieces of feedback that I've gotten after moving through this is it would be really helpful to have this in a more visual sense. So, this is my attempt to do that. And this week we are uncovering shadow. That's our theme. But it's very important to me that you know that we have been practicing this theme the entire time. We've been learning to uncover shadow the entire time. It's just that this week we are looking at it as a specific theme for this week in the process, because what we've been doing is what's called storming and norming. We've been creating a container inside of the group where the conditions, we've gotten to know the conditions inside the container to where our protective managerial parts can start to trust us to allow parts of our shadow to come to the surface. We needed to storm and norm as a group. And that's why this is a process, okay? I have two readings, two books that I want you to read in order to learn about the shadow. One is Wild Mind, and the other one is No Bad Parts. No Bad Parts is about internal family systems, which is the most effective way to practice uncovering your shadow that I have found in my experience of doing this work. And that's because it is both relational and experiential, which means it's embodied. So it gets you out of just understanding and into application, which is the best way to make sure that you are not emotionally or spiritually bypassing and gaining just more intellectual information and tricking yourself into thinking that you're actually growing and changing rather than applying what you're learning intellectually in an experiential way and actually physically transforming and growing, becoming more whole and fully integrated. So, uncovering the shadow. Elements, what is the shadow? Elements of our psyche that are unknown to us. The shadow is not what you know. Sometimes people think that the shadow is just bad stuff, or the shadow is stuff that we would not want to share with people in public or people in our communities that we are aware that we do. That is not shadow. That is on the edge, and your ego has decided that I want to suppress that because I don't want to share it. I might be ashamed of it, or if I share it, I might be fearful that I may stay attached. By being authentic, I may risk staying attached to the people that are in my life because they've gotten to know the identity that I have, and this wouldn't fit in. And so in a way, it's exiled somewhere here in the middle. It might be an addiction. It might be something that you are doing that you just don't feel comfortable sharing, but that is not the shadow. The shadow is unconscious, and then it comes into that zone. And so we have over here our identity. We have the way that we show up in our life and relationships in order to fit in, that has formed as we've survived to get to where we are today. And from an IFS model, we have parts, and we have 3 main types of parts. We have managerial parts, which are all a part of our ego and how we show up in our lives and relationships that help manage our existence, help us stay safe, help us fit in, help us show up on time. And then we have exiled parts of us that have not quite fit in. These might be have been directly or indirectly shamed or pushed away, or they might just not have been useful for our survival, right, in order to fit in. And so they get exiled. They don't quite fit into the identity that's been formed. And then we have firefighters or saboteurs. When an exiled part does come to the surface and it doesn't quite fit in, the firefighter parts or the saboteur parts are the parts that get ignited in order to push those exiled parts back down, because maybe we don't quite know how to allow that to fit into our identity at that time. And so then what we have is sinister shadow and golden shadow. The sinister shadow are the parts of our collective or individual unconscious that we consider to be unhealthy or downright dangerous and bad for our existence. The golden shadow is what's sometimes called beautiful monsters, or the parts of us that are related to our divinity, our unique gifts that we can share with the world, that our soul deeply wants to be able to integrate and bring out into the world. So how do you do this? How do you actually do shadow work? First, you start to notice your projections. You notice tests and triggers. So tests are challenges in your life that make you harden against the experience of your life. So they ignite your managerial parts. And then finally, patterns, avoidance, and addictions. It's very, very important to recognize that shadow characteristics can be negative, which means the ego considers it to be beneath it, or positive, what the ego considers to be above it, okay? So that might mean if my ego might think that this person who just shows up in this incredibly Buddha-like way, there's no way that I could be like that, right? It just doesn't fit into my identity of how I see the world. And so I project that onto other individuals. Now, when I project this golden shadow onto others and through me onto others, this has the ability to be dangerous because that individual could take that on to their ego. It could fuel up their ego. But if they are also doing shadow work, they may see that and be able to open and to be with it and not take that on into their ego. Now, it's important to recognize that these are locked away. They're hidden to protect us, okay, in order to help us stay safe. And until we can relax, open, and connect, to integrate these and to transmute them, to become whole, to become a more full person. And so, in review, often the sinister shadow holds something sacred, meaning it's been exiled to fit in, but if we uncover it, take responsibility for it, learn to soften, and cease projecting, we can craft and create a healthier personality. We become a more whole person. Often the golden shadow holds something divine, meaning our soul's gift that many never find or get to share with the world, okay? And it's very, very important to recognize the ego is not bad. And without the shadow and repression of parts of the shadow into the shadow to lock away these different parts of ourselves, human life might not be able to be possible. So what I want you to recognize is this is this beautiful cycle of what fits into the ego, which is not bad, it's simply managerial, and then what gets repressed and what is suppressed. That suppression on the previous page, what's in here might just be suppression, which means you are conscious of suppressing these parts of yourself. Maybe these are related to avoidance and addictions or things that you do that socially are unacceptable in terms of your identity or how you show up in the world, but that's not in your shadow. The shadow is completely and fully repressed. And through the process of relaxing, opening, connecting, and creating a brave space, we start to be able to allow these exiled parts of ourselves to drift to the surface where we can then learn how to integrate or transmute them into a more healthy identity, okay? So you are not your ego. You are not your shadow, all right? You are experiencing your life through them. You are that which is experiencing, okay? And as we uncover and integrate the shadow, or our power grows and the ego switches to be in service of the heart. So the ego is useful because it helps us fit in. So as we start to uncover these parts of ourselves in our shadow and our power starts to grow in service of being a healthy human being, our ego can reshape in the form of the service of the heart. But it can also reshape in service of our sinister shadow, right? In terms of projecting more and more onto the world. So you have a choice. And what that choice is is to practice. And the way that we practice is we notice and own our projections. We notice tests and triggers, and we notice patterns of avoidance and addiction. Now, it's much easier to do this in the group setting. Inside the group setting, we start to notice our projections onto other men in the space. We start to notice by making embodied stretches we start to notice how our life is testing us or what is triggering us in the group. And then we start to notice patterns of avoidance and addiction. Once we learn how to do this inside of the conditions of the group, which is easier because we've created a brave space with structure, we then move out of the group into a higher stakes environment where we learn to notice our projections, we learn to notice tests and triggers outside of the group, and we learn to notice patterns of avoidance and addiction. And then here we bring this back into the group where we reflect, and it's a cycle. Okay? Now, the most useful framework that we have found in the Unshakable Man over the past 7 years to do this work of shadow work is IFS, or Internal Family Systems. What Internal Family Systems is a framework for performing shadow work, which is both experiential and relational, meaning it's not just in your head. You are practicing it and embodying it, which helps us sidestep the tendency to trick ourselves into thinking that if we understand this information intellectually, we have somehow been able to integrate it relationally, and that is not always true. The ego is a very tricky thing. It can trick us into thinking that because we have learned something intellectually, we're now able to embody it or to actually show up in a more empowering way and to perform that behavior change. And we can't always do that. The best way to stick to that is to practice internal family systems or parts work. Okay? So this is called parts work. And so what we're doing in group is we are finding parts, getting to know parts, and we're learning to speak to parts and to speak from parts, and then bringing that out into our life and relationships where we practice it in a higher stakes environment and then bringing it back in. And then finally, the last piece is inner child work and taking on your shadow and gold mission. So what taking on your shadow and gold mission is recognizing that this entire process is happening, right? So you are recognizing that you have an identity and managerial parts, and that parts of you manage your existence, and you have exiled parts of you and a sinister shadow and a golden shadow, and that you are part and parcel of this entire experience which is happening, and that you are taking on your shadow mission to allow and to notice your projections, your tests and your triggers and your patterns of avoidance and addiction, all in service of allowing your golden shadow, your divine parts, to come to the surface and to become a whole conscious human being who can pass on more care and love in the world and show others that that is also possible. And so this week we are uncovering shadow. So what are we going to do this week? Well, this week we are going to learn, all we are going to do is drop in the group, in the space that we're in, and we're going to start to do exactly what we've been doing, but we're going to recognize that we're doing it. We're going to notice our projections in group. We're going to use embodied stretches in order to go deep and to create tests in our life that create triggers that allow us to respond to our life and our relationships in a more empowering way, finding our patterns of avoidance and addiction, and then bring that back into the group intentionally to become whole, to grow, to become an unshakable man. And then also, we're going to start to recognize that we are doing parts work, even when we didn't know it, because this work is so intuitive. We start to do it and then understand what we're doing. So we're going to start to recognize managerial parts, saying what a part of me feels this way, or going to a place inside that hasn't had a voice, being guided or witnessed by men in the group to go in and to find out, what am I feeling? Where do I feel in my body? What does that part of me need? And where else in my life has this come up? And when you're doing that, and then you bring it out into your life with awareness, you can start to respond in a more tender and open way on and in your body, and then choose to respond differently, thereby changing your patterns of avoidance or responding to tests and triggers more consciously, and then bring that back into the group where you move through the process of becoming whole. So this is how to uncover your shadow. There are many, many ways to do shadow work. If you go and read the book Wild Man by A Field Guide to the Human Psyche by Bill Plotkin, which I highly, highly recommend. I have copied and put over into the reading pages 207 through 220, which I highly recommend reading. But if you do that, please buy the book to support the author and all of the wisdom that he's put into this book. I recommend reading Wild Mind here, as well as No Bad Parts, which is a guide to internal family systems. All right, guys, I'll see you in group.